Welcome again to another Authors at Google program here in New York. We're really excited to have Kimberly Dozier in here today. Covering events in the Middle East as a foreign correspondent for CBS News, Kimberly Dozier earned a reputation for being on top of the news, from disputed territories of Israel to the war in Afghanistan and the hunt for Osama bin Laden. She reported on the war in Iraq from 2003 until she was injured by a car bomb in 2006. Previously, she was a London bureau chief and chief European correspondent for CBS Radio News, as well as television reporter for CBS News. She covered world events ranging from the crisis in the Balkans to the death of Princess Diana. She's received 4 prestigious Gracie Awards from the American Women in Radio and Television, including the Grand Gracie Award in 2007 for her body of work in Iraq. Today, she'll be talking about her awesome new book, Breathing the Fire, but she can definitely speak on this topic better than I can. So please put your hands together. Warm welcome for Kimberly Dozier.
Thank you. And thanks for coming out on Memorial Day weekend, or the start thereof. Most of my bosses are in cars, planes, etc., headed somewhere else. So solidarity, we're all still working. Yeah, I wrote this book rather under duress. I was sort of tricked into it. In Bethesda Naval Hospital, during the long recuperation, when I was lying there, legs not quite working yet, I had 2 great advisors who used to stop by. And one was a Franciscan monk who would stop by in the full flowing brown robes, the beard, and had to wear all the yellow isolation gown stuff over top of it. He'd sweat profusely, but he'd still hang out every couple of days. He used to counsel the victims of 9/11 as a fire chaplain. And Brother David told me, "Oh, but you write so well. You really should write this down." Yeah. And there was another guy, a Navy psychologist, who I'd asked to speak to instead of taking drugs to get over the grief. And that's a good tool for some people, but I basically wanted to talk through everything I was feeling. And so I started this process, wrote the first 5 or 6 chapters of the book over about 5 or 6 or 7 times, kind of lost count. And then I went looking for a publisher and found that they say books on Iraq don't sell. Maybe if you'd come out with it the first couple years, people would care, but people don't want to hear about Iraq anymore. Well, I persevered. After about 9 months, I found a small publisher willing to let me tell the story. Now, it's been a couple of years, so I'll refresh your memory on what happened. I was on a Memorial Day patrol with my camera crew, Paul Douglas and James Brolin from CBS News, cameraman and soundman. And we were going out with a man named Captain James Alex Funkhauser from the 4th Infantry Division. He had been training Iraqi police to take over from U.S. patrols. And we were going to go to a place called the Karada. Now, the Karada is that neighborhood where, remember that emblematic statue of Saddam that got pulled over in the first 24 hours? That's the Karada. It was so safe that the Iraqis were about to take over the very next day. But the first place Captain Funkhauser wanted to take us was a place where, very uncharacteristically for the area, a roadside bomb had gone off the day before and had hit an Iraqi patrol. He said, "I want to look into the eyes of the people on that street. I've met them before. They won't be able to lie to me. They know where the insurgent cell is operating from. They always know if there are strangers in their neighborhood." So that's how we ended up at that first stop of the morning on what was supposed to be a 3-hour tour with these guys. And we were outside of our Humvees, about 12-man U.S. patrol plus Paul, James, and I. And we were walking towards an Iraqi tea stand with a bunch of Iraqis to talk to. Now, Captain Funkhauser explained to me as we walked down the street, he said, "See that bombed villa next to us?" It looked like it was sort of collapsing inward. He said, "We think the insurgent cell could be operating from there. They could be watching us right now." They were. Not from there, it turns out, but from an apartment building nearby. They command detonated the 500-pound car bomb when we all got within about 20 feet of it. I remember going into Blackness and not being able to move for a long period of time. You don't feel pain. You're just like getting hit on the head, but 1,000 times harder than has ever happened before. And I remembered reading the account of ABC cameraman Doug Vogt, who'd been hit together with Bob Woodruff 4 months before exactly. And Doug said when the roadside bomb first hit the two of them, he couldn't move. So his words came back to me. I'm like, okay, Doug, I can't move. Okay, Doug, I still can't. Doug, when can I move? I was having this argument in my head with this poor cameraman who'd gone through this before. When I finally came to, I saw a blazing car. It wasn't the car bomb. That was obliterated, but it had set fire to the cars on either side of it. It had also set fire to a Humvee that was in the parked line that we'd all just gotten out of. That's why a lot of people assumed that we were in a Humvee when we were hit. No, not so. And then I started having the debate, shall I call for help? Because I could hear other people calling out. In the rules of triage, airway, breathing, and circulation, if someone calls out, that means they've got airway and breathing. You go to the quiet people first because maybe they need their airway cleared. Maybe they need their heart restarted. And I was having this debate. If I call out for help, they won't come to me. But my legs really, really hurt. So I think I need help. And it went round and round. Then I lifted my head because that's all I could do and saw the burning car and decided, well, those flames, that must be what's causing the burning on my legs. And so I finally called for help. Luckily for us, a patrol of Iowa National Guardsmen had run into the scene. They had been driving by, heard the explosion, and they ran into carnage. 6 of us, let's see, Captain Funkhauser and his translator Sam were nearest to the bomb, killed instantly. So was James Brolin. Paul Douglas was fighting for his life, had severe injuries to his legs like I did. And the Iowa National Guardsmen, even when they ran in, by the time they ran in, already the medic from our patrol had rushed around to everyone. He'd spoken to me. He'd known that I had airway and breathing and went to the next person. He got to Paul, tied a tourniquet on him, and then went to the next guy and the next guy. So he was working that fast. In that 2 minutes, it took these other guys to run in. They started working on those of us they could save. One of the Iowa National Guardsmen stayed with Paul until the moment he died. Didn't want him to die alone. Another staff sergeant, a guy named Jeremy Koch, started working on me. He said that when he ran into the scene, I was the last person waiting for aid. That there was a medic next to one soldier and other soldiers working on everybody else who was injured. So he started tying first one and then another tourniquet on me, and I remember talking to him. I can't remember what he looks like. I met him later, and it was very surreal because I knew the voice, but not the face. He did not think I was going to make it. I had shrapnel to the brain, and then both legs smashed. One of them was at a very unnatural angle, and burns from my hips to my ankles, and my right leg, basically large chunks missing. The IED, or as they call them, VBIEDs, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, it had basically blown through my leg. And so I was peppered with shrapnel. But he said, he was going to keep working on me and stay with me. If I died, I wasn't going to die alone. It took almost an hour for the casualty evacuation team to get to us because in Baghdad, traffic doesn't move. And in Baghdad, there are lots of other things going on. There were 5 other car bombs in the capital alone that day. Our CASEVAC team, the casualty evacuation team, they stopped first at the wrong car bomb, just a mile from us. And then, still trying to find us, they drove past us. So by the time they got to us, it was almost an hour. And by the time we got to the Baghdad Casualty Hospital, I'd lost more than half my blood. So myself and a guy named Staff Sergeant Nathan Reed and Sergeant Justin Farrar, who was Captain Funkhauser's personal security detail, but had been assigned to me instead. The three of us were really close to the edge. Some amazing doctors at the military hospital put us back together. I don't remember this part. I only remember the first 10 minutes of the bomb scene. The next thing I know, I wake up in Landstuhl with my family around me and a nurse nearby. Well, the first thing I woke up to was the nurse. And I didn't understand why I couldn't speak. I had a tube down my throat. And I was very frustrated at my inability to communicate. And at first, you can't remember the last place you were or why you're there. And as my family came into the room and they gave me pen and paper and I started asking questions, where are Paul and James? What happened? I remember an explosion, boom, then people screaming. I have all these scribbled notes. It's chicken scratch, but I was trying to communicate from the moment I opened my eyes. What was important about that day, all this stuff I just told you, is not that it happened to some reporter, but that that's the journey that the combat injured are taking. I didn't know about it. I had heard explosions going off from dawn to dusk for 3 years reporting in Baghdad. I had reported over and over the numbers of dead, but I didn't report the numbers of the injured. I would see, 5 dead, 3 injured. I don't know what I thought. 3 injured, they've got cuts on their fingers or something. So that's part of the reason I decided to put all this in print. And a lot of the details I've just given you, some are what I could remember. But afterwards, I tried to piece it all together. I tried to track down everyone from the scene. Part of it was the reporter side, trying to take control of the situation. And the other part was, as Brother David and my naval psychologist, Vic Huertas, both said, this is your journey from victim to survivor. This is how you do it. You try to remember it all, and you take the poison out of it. Now, that's not a way that works for everybody, but it's a way that works for a lot of people, and it worked for me. In the hospital, to pick up the story again, once I got to Bethesda Naval Hospital, they started the long process of putting me back together. They'd already put titanium rods in my legs in Landstuhl, the regional medical center there. But now they had to do something like 24 operations to prepare all the burns for donor skin to put on top of it, which they took from other parts of me. They take donor skin with a potato grater, and I won't go into any other details beyond that. Let's just say I was like a human science experiment. And, the first several weeks, I woke up and thought about, the nightmare that my body was. And when I'd look down and see them changing the bandages, I could see just basically my legs, especially my right leg, it was a sea of ground beef. I only found out later that they almost took off my right leg in Landstuhl, but they gave it an extra 24 hours. It had turned black, and that could either mean that it was dead or just bruised. They gave it a chance. So here I stand on both legs. The next thing after I got the physical battle more or less not over with, but once I was closed, I was well on my way. And closed is what they call you once the donor skin is stitched on and the grafts start to take. Then it was the emotional battle, because I started thinking about Paul and James and why they were there and why we'd been there that day. Why had I lived and they died? And what I was told by the nurses and the corpsmen who came in and out of my room, this was the same sort of nightmare that the other injured troops on my hallway were going through. One of the corpsmen said she'd walk into a room with a 6'5" Marine with all the tattoos, and he'd be bawling his eyes out, not about his injuries, but about his buddies. And what Vic and Brother David kept telling me is that, okay, I talked my head off. At the time, I was a 40-year-old woman from the Oprah generation. Now, I'm a couple years older. But that's not what young soldiers or Marines are trained to do. They're trained to say, I'm fine. I'm fine. They're trained to say it in the hospital bed. They're trained to say it when they come back from 2 or 3 deployments to their families. They often don't share even the little things, thinking, who would understand it, or why should I bring the horrors of war back home? They lock it down. So my journey of dealing with the guilt of surviving and the grief of surviving is part of what I put into the book to explain. And hopefully there's some people out there who will maybe think about doing the same thing. If they don't talk about it, maybe they'll write about it, or they'll blog about it anonymously. It can be as simple as what was happening to me in the hospital bed was I could remember the bomb going off. And it was almost like a physical sensation. I would feel the slam and then the flying through space again, and then it would stop. By the time I left Bethesda Naval, that had stopped. But I've talked to some other friends who've been through multiple roadside bombs in Iraq or Afghanistan. They're still living with it. And there are things that can bring it back. I hope that people are starting to talk to me. I hope that they'll start talking to each other. Now, then we get to the whole recovery piece. The most important part of recovery for me was anger. A doctor in Landstuhl told me that he didn't know if I would ever walk properly again. And I don't know if he was pulling reverse psychology on me, but it worked. When I started working out with a physiotherapist at Bethesda Naval, and working out consisted of her picking up my legs that I couldn't lift and then trying to break the fused bone in the knees and the tendons just by squeezing it like this for up to an hour at a time while I screamed through gritted teeth. That's the start of physiotherapy. But the anger of wondering, am I going to walk again? Am I going to be able to run again? That helped. The other thing that helped was having my dad at my side and having my boyfriend Pete nearby. Pete also worked in a war zone, and Dad had been in the military. So neither of them were angry at me for how I got injured. That often happens afterwards to some trauma patients or people who've been in the combat zone for maybe a second or third tour. Sometimes their families are like, why did you go back? Especially people who, like journalists, who choose to be there. My mom, however, we had to banish to the operating room, to the waiting room. Now, here's a common thing that happens with trauma patients, and doctors see it all the time. Their loved ones take care of them for the first several weeks when they're in that delicate phase, and that's great. That's part of the reason I think I did so well, and it's something that the troops could use more of. Not all of them can afford to have their families with them. Now, the Army tries to make sure that their families have somewhere to stay that's either free or affordable, but rehabilitation can take up to a year, and some of these people, they can't leave their jobs for that long. So they have to choose between bringing the soldier or Marine or airman home where they won't get as good medical care, or keeping them in a place like Walter Reed, Bethesda Naval, or Brooke Army Medical Center and trying to stay at their side. So yes, that was great that my family was there. But after a bit, they want to coddle you, and they kind of can hold you back. So Mom didn't like hearing me scream through gritted teeth. I knew that I needed to do that so that my legs would work again. So there comes a point where you start, pushing loved ones away and saying, all right, I'm going to stand on my own 2 feet because I have to start now, or I won't be able to 6 months from now. Now, it took months of rehabilitation to go from walking to running, and I mostly did that in New Zealand. I was going to go to a VA hospital. I wanted to, but the social worker at Bethesda Naval said, why don't you go to this private physiotherapy place? It's a sports place. And I thought, well, they don't understand blast injuries. The problems with Walter Reed, the problems with veterans' health care, and how overtaxed the system is by the current influx of injured, that hadn't come to light yet. So they wouldn't tell me outright, but they were trying to tell me, go to somewhere with enough people to give you one-on-one care. So I ended up with one-on-one care for 6 months, 3 to 4 times a week, 3 to 4 hours a time. And when I got back and the doctors who treated me before saw me, I got these responses like, miracle recovery. Miracle recovery? Well, I think it's a testament to the doctors who put me together and then the private physiotherapy, all of those hours a week. And I'm not sure what the figures are, but I'm hoping that some of the veterans out there or the injured troops listening will compare notes and say, I did get that, or I didn't get that, or maybe if I did that, here's where I could be. I went to Brooke Army Medical Center and ran into 3 of the guys who actually revived me in the Baghdad cache, and they could not believe I was walking without a limp, much less running. So the other thing I've been trying to do since this happened 2 years ago is bring to light to the general public extremity war injuries, injuries to your arms and your legs. Now, this happens to 4 out of 5 of the injured troops, and it's happening to, if you extrapolate the figures, 4 out of 5 of the Iraqis or the Afghans who get injured by these blasts. And there are many things that happen that doctors don't know how to treat. So many of us are surviving the battlefield that we're going on to develop strange things like heterotopic ossification. What that means is that when your bones are fractured by a blast injury and they can heal like crazy and form coral that digs into your muscles. And that's what had happened in both my legs. So that meant in one of my legs, this coral-like structure was clawing into the 3 quads that were left, and I couldn't run. The only way to take it out is to wait 6 to 9 months after the original injury and then get a good old hammer and a chisel. So they had to cut through my muscles, and yes, we did put that on the air of the orthopedic surgeon taking a mallet to my bones. This is happening in great numbers to amputees and to blast-injured troops, and also to Iraqis who I know can't get the follow-up care that I got here. And then after they take the bone out, you've got to radiate the area to try to make sure it never goes back again. But I still have to always watch. So what I'm trying to educate both Congress and the American public is I know this war has been expensive, and I know the Pentagon keeps asking for money on the warfighting effort, but we do need a lot of money put into blast injury research. And it's not just going to help the troops that have been injured, it's also going to help the civilians in many parts of the world that I cover who go through this over and over. If we could have some simple cures, maybe heterotopic ossification could be dealt with by, taking some chemical supplement early on to tell the bones not to grow like that. I don't know, but it's going to take a lot of research. Now, that brings me to the final thing that I've sort of gotten on my soapbox about. I don't know if any of you saw the Newsweek article I did last week. I've come back to a country that basically doesn't want to hear much about the war in Iraq. If they don't want to hear about the war in Iraq, they want to hear even less about the war in Afghanistan. I talked to a colleague of mine who tracks these things. His name is Andrew Tyndall. He's probably he claims to be one of the only people in the United States who's watched every network newscast since the early 90s. He sits there with a stopwatch and gauges who puts what on the air. 2007, Iraq was the #1 news story. 2008, now I know it's an election year, and it's the most historic election probably of any of us in this room, of our generation, but we're headed for a record low year in terms of coverage of Iraq. Friends at news magazines say the same thing. If they put a picture from Iraq on the front cover, their sales plummet. It's as if people are really tired of the bad news, they don't want to know, so they change the channel. Now, here's the problem with that. We chose the last administration. We're going to choose the next administration. They will act in our name, and they will act in that region. Now, we may not like what many in the Arab world project upon us as a nation. And the main thing that they seem to project is we're bullies, we're invaders. If you canvass opinion either in Iraq or in the wider Arab world, the majority opinion that comes back is we have trashed Iraq and are now trying to get out precipitously without fixing the problem. So I caution Americans, I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm asking you to pay attention, because we're going to leave some sort of a legacy there, and we will be judged by that. And if we're not paying attention to what's going on the ground, how can we make decisions about what we want to happen next? So that is my wide-ranging story, spread across several chapters, and I'm told that you shouldn't start it late at night because you'll lose sleep, which is reassuring. The other thing that friends of mine have told me is, we read it out of a sense of duty, and it was really good. So I hope you find the same thing. Thank you very much. Cheers.
And wow, what courage, really. But my question to you, you were talking about at the end, what's your perspective about, you've been there, you've seen what's happening, a lot, or the little that's in the news is about the withdrawal, and kind of what your opinion is on that, and kind of what the troops think about that as well.
Well, I have to say, I haven't been there in 2 years. I've been kept on a short leash on temporary assignment in Washington, D.C. What I know of Iraq, without giving you an opinion on how many troops should be on the ground, what should happen next, because then who would trust my reporting if I went one way or the other. But what I know of living in the Middle East and watching Iraq for years under Saddam and now, it is complicated. It's full of shades of gray. Nation building takes a long time. Now I'm beginning to see both military commanders and diplomats. They're building on some of the early work that I started seeing happen in 2004, 2005. But they're building the relationships that will lead to a mature relationship with Iraq, as opposed to the big brother telling them what to do, which is how it really felt in 2003. But that takes a lot of time. That can take, that takes years. The question is, has it happened too late in terms of American political capital? Will the American public be willing to give it the time, the resources, and their tax dollars? Because it's expensive. And that, the jury's completely out on that one. Yeah. And also, in terms of the Iraqis, a lot of the people who were hopeful about how it would turn out early on either have been driven out of the country or have been killed. So one of the hardest parts right now, I know, for people on the ground is to find people they can have a good working relationship with, who won't sell them down the river at the next, when a better deal comes along. The Sunni Awakening, for instance, some friends of mine who worked on brokering that said, right now we are offering the Sunnis the best deal in the souk. Next week, next month, who knows? Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned that part of getting through what happened to you is dealing with the anger and that being almost a motivator. But how did that affect kind of your perception of being in Iraq, and the U.S. being in Iraq in general? I mean, I know as a reporter you have to be objective, but just on a personal note, I mean, did that sort of stimulate or inspire kind of any feelings about us being there to begin with, and kind of the sentiment having been there, and seeing how people feel about us being there and your perception? I mean, how did that sort of change or not change, or did you think about that a lot?
Oh, in other words, did I have any sort of personal blowback or resentment over the war for being there?
Or did that change, when you were there after what happened?
The strange thing is, I've never gotten sort of furious or angry with the bombers. I mean, I refer to them as, I use a couple of swear words to refer to them sometimes, but it was a Sunni Al-Qaeda offshoot group. I don't approve of their methods. I understand that a special forces team took out the cell who hit us that very night. The bombers resisted arrest, so were taken out then and there. But at the same time, I have to remember that I don't know what drove these guys. Did one of them lose a child at a checkpoint shooting? Or did they feel like we were siding with the Shiites instead of the Sunnis and this was their only way out? I'll never know. I guess I've concentrated mostly on what the incident meant in terms of ripping away my ignorance of what the combat injured go through. And in terms of the war in Iraq, so what makes me special? So many other people got injured. I'd been there so long, it almost had to happen at some point. I had just hoped it wouldn't be like this.
There's one quick follow-up is, do you think that given the complexities that you've seen, and obviously just even what you just described and sort of the relationship between different groups there and, people reacting by different motivations, maybe family members killed and whatnot, I mean, do you think that there is a solution? Like, do you think we'll ever solve the problem there? Do you think we'll ever succeed? Or do you think it'll always kind of linger and never be solved?
Well, the thing is, we Americans, we like black and white solutions, thumbs up or down. And across the Middle East, every time we get a semi-peace deal that's halfway to something between the Israelis and the Palestinians, a lot of people want to say, yay, that's it, we're done. Well, no, not quite. I think it's going to be more degrees, 60-40, 70-30, and that's how you measure success in that part of the world. And it's going to take a long time. I think it's the best way for it to happen is something like changing the warps of thread from one color in a weaving to the next. And, you start changing to the new color bit by bit, going from military action to diplomacy and nation building. But the rate of change and how successful the change will be, that's what I'm here for. That's what I'd like to go back to monitor step by step.
Thank you.
Hey, I've got two questions. One is sort of a follow-up on this. In the hypothetical scenario, you're the president of the United States. What would you do?
I'd get some really good advisors. It's very interesting to watch the three candidates because all three of them say, we're going to do this, but they all say, we'll defer to our military advisors. So I understand campaign rhetoric. I also understand that once you're in the job and you've got the reports coming in, things change. So I'll be really curious to see what they do, whoever it is, once they're in office. I'm hoping that I think whichever candidate gets elected is going to embrace nations overseas in sort of a new way, and I'm hoping that that will also drive foreign reporting so that my kind of reporting and the stuff that I like to do overseas will come back in vogue. People won't change the channel as much. Second question?
Second question, which is totally unrelated, and if you think it's inappropriate, that's totally fine. Can you talk about the financial strains on your family, given the fact that you were blown up and how long it took you to recover? And how does it translate to the soldiers who are in different situations when something like this happens?
That is the other big difference between my recovery and most of the troops. I was taken care of by a television network every step of the way. My salary never stopped, and anything I needed, whether it was temporary lodging in an apartment near my physiotherapist or a car to drive back and forth, they provided anything I asked for. I didn't have to fight the paperwork. My boyfriend did stay out of work for a while, which was tough on him. But other than that, I didn't have a worry about finances. The troops aren't in the same boat. So I'm sure that that helped me concentrate just on my healing because, I didn't have to jump through the hoops of Army or Marine Corps paperwork.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I also have two questions. The first is you mentioned that you had to go through a stage of anger, but it was not directed at the bombers. So I was wondering where that anger was directed. And then the second question is, do you plan to return? Do you feel like that's part of the healing process? Do you feel like that's necessary for you?
Well, the anger that I talked about was directed first at that poor doctor, the one who actually did the great surgery that is the reason I am walking straight. It's like you're going to tell me that I might not walk properly again, and at every step of the way, that sort of became a driving force. I am not going to be held back by this broken body, and sometimes it falters, and that's when the physiotherapists pick you up and say, try it again. No, that was actually good. You thought it was bad, but it was good. Try it again. In terms of going back to the Middle East, it's a place that I've studied most of my life, and I don't want this violent act to keep me from my life's work. So I did want to go back immediately last year. But what I've learned is that there are a lot of other people involved in this process across CBS News who we needed to ease into this. This wasn't a tragedy that just hit me. The whole corporation, the media doesn't expect to lose people. The soldiers, the Marines, the Air Force, they have a tradition of loss. It's painful, but they expect it. We hadn't a clue how to deal with this when it happened. And so my president, the president of CBS News and CBS Sports, Sean McManus, had to grapple with this from the beginning. He just decided to get on a plane by himself. He was supposed to be going out to an affiliate news conference, his first one, to talk to all the CBS affiliates. And he was halfway there, and Condoleezza Rice reached him on the plane to offer help. And he thought about it, and he thought about it. He's, my place is there. The airport, he basically turned around and flew to London so he could be there when Paul and James arrived and were met by their families at the airport for a memorial service. And then he flew to see me. So all that said, I've tried to be patient and tried to silence my inner rebellious teenager who says, I want it now. I will get there eventually. And I'll do it in such a way that people will be ready to see me go. Sir.
Hey, so you mentioned that people don't really want to hear about Iraq now. My question is, in the political debates, are candidates trying to get away from talking about that as well? Is there an interest in talking about this in the presidential debate? And how much of a factor is this, do you think, in the current campaign?
Well, Iraq is a sticky and contentious question with no easy answers. This is not the kind of thing a candidate is going to bring up.
Yet it's divided a lot of people so very clearly.
Well, it has, but right now people seem to be focusing on things like gas prices and the economy.
So it's less of a factor in the actual election right now.
And therefore, that has been driving a lot of the coverage. Me personally, yeah, I'd be asking them a lot of questions about Iraq. But it's also up to the American people to ask those questions.
But is it fair to? Are they actually addressing the issues in their I guess policy notes, or is it pretty much just bits? I think we should go. I think we should stay.
Well, every single candidate's website has some detailed statement on Iraq and Afghanistan. But in terms of, now I'm not covering the campaign, but those issues have fallen off the news map because as we canvass public opinion and what people care about and which factors are driving their voting, these other issues are coming up, and we're all responding to that. Look, Americans during an election year, we're going to look into our navel, and I think that's natural. And all of my colleagues who do political reporting, they're getting lots of FaceTime. I'm just saying, buddy, wait until next year. I'm going to be back.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Sure.
It's always been curious to me, like you mentioned, I mean, so much is still going on in Iraq, and I mean, it's still very real. Every day, what happens there, people that die, the complex issues that are there, but the media doesn't cover it anymore because TV ratings don't support, or like you said, magazine sales don't support interest from people in in this issue anymore as much as they did anyway. So like, it seems like a very complex thing because you have the public that really doesn't care more or less as much, or maybe not doesn't care isn't the right word. Maybe it's more they're almost tired of it because it's just been bombarded. They've been bombarded with it for the past few years, that it almost creates like this separation between, making the right decision, which really is going to be figured out by having experience and insight from people who have been there, like yourself, and people who understand the Middle East and what's happening there, and what's realistic and what's good for Iraq as far as like whether we should just pick up and go or try to put some of the pieces together. So like, what do you think the best way to keep Americans sort of understanding of what's going on, and I guess books like this in a way sort of do that in a sense to keep people aware of the seriousness of it. But how do we tackle that issue as a society so that we make the right decisions and that we don't sort of fall off into like what's popular and what's current and interesting in the media?
Well, I mean,
did my question make sense?
I hear what you're saying.
I kind of lost myself halfway through that question, but
I was following. I mean, part of the answers here in this room, you all work for one of the biggest organizations for disseminating information, and Google News does that. I know I'm on that site every day. I'm probably being a little unfair to my bosses in that when is the last time that we've covered a war that's gone on for this long? Is this normal? Is there a natural news cycle such that there's not so much to say? The other thing is there's the risk-reward factor. It costs a lot of money to staff an Iraq bureau. It's very dangerous. We've lost people. We keep losing people, more Iraqis than foreign staff. And the audience doesn't want to hear about it right now. So there's that partly driving it, and that's an economic reality. But then when you get to the public service part, but we still have to educate them, then part of it is my problem in that I got to come up with a new way to tell the story that's going to engage, my bosses, that's at the evening news, that's a mini audience. If I can engage them, then that means I won my chance to engage, the 5-6 million viewers a night on the evening news. So I also have to take responsibility for finding a new way to get the point across. And again, that's partly why I wrote the book, because I thought, well, I've been through a pretty unique experience here. I'm not in uniform, but I can probably tell you something that you had no idea about, because I sure didn't. Did I answer?
Yeah, you did.
Sort of?
I think you did. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming today. I have two questions also. The first one is, all along I've been concerned about the number of wounded that we haven't been talking about. And sort of early on, there was a woman soldier who had lost part of a leg and part of an arm. I believe she was on the cover of Newsday or Newsweek, one of those. And those people in those numbers have kind of fallen by the wayside in favor of as you talked about, the number of dead. And I think that for those people, as you know much better now, and for the soldiers who are coming back from war who aren't injured on the outside, it's been a perennial problem for war, people coming back from war, and I'm wondering if we're doing any better job of that for those people who are sort of taught, you just hold it all in. And then we hear about sort of sporadically domestic violence that comes up with those folks. And I'm wondering if you're hearing anything that we're doing a better job of that now than we used to, or are there efforts in that regard to help
Yeah.
those people?
Like a lot of things in this war, it's been a really steep learning curve for the military. And I've watched them mess up in the beginning and reported it, and now I'm watching them catch up. I'm a little worried about the people who are getting left behind, and I hope that there's going to be something retroactive. What the military has started doing now, the Army, for instance, is opening warrior transition units, they're called, so that when they see a soldier who is acting out, who might be exhibiting post-traumatic stress disorder, this is a place where they can be transferred, treated, and hopefully either healed so they can go back to work, or that they can have their problem taken seriously and they can get help instead of turning into a walking time bomb, so to speak. But one of the problems is that there's still a lot of ignorance out there about what is combat stress, what is post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of people assumed that I had PTSD. PTSD is actually a series of symptoms that you add together. You have to have 8 or 10 of them all together to be classified as someone with PTSD. If you only have a couple, you're suffering from some combat stress. I had nightmares. I had a couple of flashbacks. I didn't have uncontrollable anger. I didn't have a tendency towards violence. I didn't go to substance abuse. I actually had to be talked into taking a lot of my meds. So that ignorance out there is keeping people from getting help. Because you've got troops who come back who, they've told me things about, I kept seeing this image. I kept replaying that day. I kept feeling the force of this one explosion. But they're afraid to tell their wives because they're afraid, or their husbands, because they're afraid of the stigma. They think, oh, that's PTSD. Well, no, actually, those are a couple of symptoms of combat stress. If you get help, which can be as simple as just talking to the chaplain or talking to your staff sergeant or even just blogging about it. I mean, those are some of the things I know have been recommended. Then you can keep that from becoming a real problem. But if you ignore those couple of symptoms of combat stress, then what tends to happen is they multiply. Then you start snapping at your spouse, and then you don't understand why you're not getting along with anybody, so you start isolating yourself, and then you start going to the bar and drinking. You know what? And then after a year of ignoring these problems, you got full-blown PTSD. So anyway, that's part of why I put some of this in print, because heck, since everybody already presumed I had it, I wasn't going to be losing anything by saying, no, but here's what I did have and here's how I dealt with it. So I hope that that becomes part of this debate, the way the military is trying to take care of its own.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thanks.
My second question is, given that much of the country may feel that we're in Iraq for all the wrong reasons and that we've been there far too long and we've invested far too much, and also given that in those shades of gray, there's always somebody who's willing to say very vocally that we've done the wrong thing and that we are, whatever nasty word they care to apply as a country. Do you really feel that there is a decent exit channel strategy for the U.S. where we're not going to come out looking like idiots in one form or another?
Well, I've seen some of my colleagues, professionals I've known for years throughout the Middle East, working on an exit strategy right now. They won't give you a timeline for it because they have no idea what will take when. But they're working on getting the government on the ground to do the job for itself in such a way that we can step away. Now, what I saw over and over in the first few years was that there was such an emphasis on turning things over that it's like we kept taking the training wheels off too fast. And then the enemy, whoever the enemy was, would take advantage of that. And the whole thing would come crashing in again. So, you know, when do you pull back and let things go wobbly for a bit and hope no one's going to knock it over? That is something that, well, I'm glad I don't have to make that call. I have the easy job. I can stand on the outside and, kind of throw rocks at them and say, not quite, try again. So I can't give you an answer to when we should. I can just tell you that, yes, I see what they're working on.
So you feel that there is some exit strategy where we could emerge as a country, not looking like all we did was mess things up while we were there.
You could say there have been various exit strategies since 2003, and that strategy is always evolving. What I'm telling you is, I have some friends I know on the ground who are working on different parts of the exit strategy, and they're both in the State Department, the Pentagon, and I see some hopeful signs in some areas. But I'm not on the ground, and I don't have, a full picture. Full pictures in Iraq are hard to get and hard to gauge. And my own colleagues are, having more and more trouble getting to the news because it's just tough to cover it on the ground. So I guess I would end with a salute to them for continuing to do the job, and also a salute to Captain Funkhauser. This Memorial Day will be the second Memorial Day that his family spends without him, and also to Paul Douglas and James Brolin for making the ultimate sacrifice to try to bring everybody this story.
Thank you.
Thank you.